So on behalf of Concord Porter Climate Action Working Group, I want to welcome everyone and do a simple honoring of the land that we all are sitting on. Is part of the land, unceded land from the Lenape people, and we express gratitude to be here and yearn and seek for reconciliation and collaboration with them about the stewardship of this land. And today also we're holding in our hearts all of those who are suffering in the world, but specifically those who are fleeing violence in Europe, and pray for their safety and well-being. So again, I'm going to just mention that this is our second session in a series that will cover 8 months to help congregations, and specifically the sponsoring organization, the Concord Porter of Yearly Meeting of Philadelphia Yearly Meeting Quakers, to help us develop a concrete, tangible, usable plan to prepare us for any kind of extreme weather or disaster that we need to deal with in terms of our own facility and community, but also ways in which we can relate to, support, and collaborate with the wider community as it seeks to recover from any extreme weather event. And today's focus is specifically on health risks and the impacts of climate and extreme weather on health. And we're really thrilled to have Dr. Richard Tolin with us today, who is going to be our first speaker. He'll speak for about 40-45 minutes, and then we'll have a chance to have questions and comments and discussion. We'll take a quick break, and then I'll turn it over to Julia Menzo, who's with the Lutheran Disaster Response, which we're so lucky to have her in our region as someone who has extensive experience and can really answer a lot of our questions about how to approach the task we've assigned ourselves to be ready to move forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Tolin and look forward to your comments and questions. I invite you to put comments and questions in the chat. I'll keep my eye on that, and I will be the moderator once we get to that period. So thank you very much to our guests and to all of you who are here, and I look forward to learning with you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Let me try and share my screen here. Let me get this. Here we go. So I've been asked to talk about the impact of climate change on health. So climate change alters the air we breathe, the food we eat, the water we drink, the pathogens we encounter, and the weather we experience. It's no wonder that climate change is threatening the health of virtually all plants and species on Earth. The World Health Organization has declared that climate change poses the greatest threat to human health, and the Lancet Commission on Pollution and Health states that environmental pollution is the largest cause of premature reversible death and disability in the world today. Climate change and environmental pollution are intimately linked because both are caused primarily by the extraction and combustion of fossil fuels. As you can see from this slide, this is obviously a huge topic with health being impacted in virtually every organ system. It's a pretty large topic for a relatively short presentation. So what I'm going to do today is to focus just on two aspects, heat exposure and illness, and then air pollution. Air pollution because we're all currently being harmed, and there are things we can do to protect ourselves and our communities. So if we define an excessive heat event day as any day in which the temperature itself is responsible for a statistically measurable increase in mortality. You can see in Philadelphia in the 20th century, there were 6 such days per year. This coming decade, we expect to have about 46. And by the end of the century, unless we make some major changes, there'll be about 73 days a year. By the end of the century, again, unless we make major changes that we don't yet appear to be making, we'll have more summer days with a temperature over 100 degrees than under 100 degrees in Philadelphia. So the body's main evaporation or sweating is the principal mechanism for heat loss in a hot environment, but sweating becomes inefficient when the humidity is above 75%. Heat exhaustion begins with general muscle weakness, sudden excessive sweating, and then nausea and vomiting. Heat stroke occurs when the body temperature reaches 104 degrees, and at that point, there is no further sweating, skin becomes dry, kidneys and brain begin to shut down, and confusion is present. With heat exhaustion, what we do is we move the victim to a cooler environment and provide fluids to drink. Heat stroke is a medical emergency with a very high mortality, and it requires calling 911, an ambulance to the hospital, and intravenous fluids to prevent death. Now, who's at risk? So this slide outlines the kinds of people and situations that increase the risk. If you look at medications, there are a number of commonly used medications that I list here on the slide that interfere with the body's ability to regulate temperature properly. So people on these medicines are at risk. People who have chronic lung disease, chronic heart disease, and kidney disease are less tolerant of these changes and become sicker quicker. People who reside in urban heat islands have greater exposure, as do people with certain occupations who work hard outside on hot days. We've all heard stories of the occasional high school student football player who dies of heat stroke during preseason practice in August. This is a photograph of a typical urban suburban scene. And you can see it has areas of asphalt, grass, trees. If we take the same photograph with a lens that identifies heat, we can see the hot areas are the lighter colors. So we can see on this photograph that the asphalt and the parking lot are the hottest places. The grass here, purple, not quite so hot. And where there are shade trees, it's darkest, that's where it's coolest. So this defines what occurs with heat islands. If we look at this map of Philadelphia, of heat islands, of where we get excessively hot temperatures in the summer, the darker red are the areas where we have these heat islands. And if you notice, mostly in North Philadelphia and in West Philadelphia, and some in South Philadelphia. And in these areas, the temperature on a warm summer day in these red areas can be 6 or 7 degrees hotter than the areas that are cooler. Now, these heat islands occur because there are fewer shade trees and more asphalt in these areas. But if these areas are 6 or 7 degrees hotter than the cool areas, and maybe 7 or 8 degrees hotter than the shaded areas in Lower Merion, for example, in Bala Cynwyd, we can see, climate change is expected to increase temperatures by, hopefully less than 4 degrees, 3 or 4 degrees Fahrenheit, but maybe 5 or 6. But we can see that the localized harms of these heat islands exceeds the harms of climate change, and may certainly dramatically increase the danger of climate change with regard to heat injury. Now, these areas are predominantly inhabited by people of color. And so the question is, well, why is that? Is that a coincidence? Well, no, it's not a coincidence. During the Depression, there was a shortage of housing, and banks would only lend to the very wealthiest of people. And so one of the New Deal programs was the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which insured loans primarily for white people so that they could buy homes and become homeowners. And what they did is they asked local real estate agents in each city to color code neighborhoods. And their definition of red, they wanted color-coded red, neighborhoods that had flat terrain, odors, that were highly paved, manufacturing, and inhabited by immigrants and Negroes. That was the definition described as red of areas that were not worthy of federal investment in housing. Now, this didn't create segregation, but it enforced it and caused it continuous. There was no segregation in housing in the 19th century. There was something in the 1880s, 1890s, African Americans, Negroes at that time, they lived in neighborhoods where they could afford, and similar neighborhoods to where whites could afford the same neighborhoods. They were intermingled. And because they lived in intermingled neighborhoods, they had similar political and neighborhood interests. That changed in the 20th century when racial zoning began. They created these patterns of African Americans living in these neighborhoods, and then this was further encoded by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And for reasons that are sort of too complex for this discussion today, these housing patterns became multi-generational. And so you can see that that the fact that people of color live in areas where there are lots of pavement, manufacturing, fewer trees, became basically enshrined into law. Now let's talk a little bit about air pollution. Most of us don't fully appreciate how dangerous air pollution is because the death certificates read things like stroke and emphysema. They don't say that our loved ones died of air pollution, but air pollution causes more heart disease than cholesterol, more lung disease than tobacco. All of us have already suffered some degree of health harm from air pollution. We've inhaled into our lungs toxins with every breath we have taken throughout our entire lives. And those toxins are there primarily because of the burning of fossil fuels, whether it be on our roadways, in the industrial plant in the next town, or in our own homes and kitchens. All of us have family members who have some chronic disease exacerbated or caused by air pollution. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with looking at data in this format, don't worry, I'm going to walk you through all of this. For the moment, let's skip all the reading on the right, on the text on the left, and look just for the moment at the graphs on the right. All three graphs plot severity of air pollution on the horizontal axis, with worsening pollution moving to the right, and risk of mortality on the vertical axis, with higher mortality higher on the graph. Graphs A and B at the top, graph A plots particulate matter pollution, the particulate matter small, we call it PM 2.5, smaller than 2.5 microns. These are particles that are a result of combustion of fossil fuels that are so tiny, you can't see them. And they're so tiny that when you inhale them, they can actually settle on the inner lining of the alveoli, inner lining of the lung. And when they settle on the inner lining of the lung, they set off a cascade of reactions that leads to inflammation and heart and lung disease. So this graph shows the increasing all-cause mortality. It goes up as you move to the right with greater short-term exposure. This map, graph B, plots increasing mortality with ozone exposure, short-term 8 hours ozone exposure moving to the right. Ozone is one of those pollutants that's a secondary pollutant. It is formed when tailpipe emissions and results of combustion interact with sunlight. And so more sunlight and more warmth with the global warming is increasing the ground level ozone and increasing our exposures. The graph on the bottom here shows chronic exposure, not the 1 day as in graph A, but this is the average over the course of a year of exposures. And this lower graph is exposures in a low ozone environment. And the upper line here is exposures in a high ozone environment. So you can see that for any level of chronic exposure to PM 2.5, high ozone makes it worse. Now, there are three takeaways from these graphs that I want you to get. The first is that there is no safe threshold of air pollution. If you look at each one of these graphs, you have to go all the way down to 0 on the pollution before you get to 0 on the risk of mortality. It's like that on all of these three graphs. So no matter what level of pollution you have, less is always better. It's much like radiation. Whatever you have, less is better. The second takeaway is that the risks on the vertical axis are not absolute risks, they're relative risks. So what that means is that if you say you take someone who, and you have them walk behind a gas power low motor, inhaling the fumes on a hot summer day when ozone levels are high, if you do that and say you double somebody's risk of dying from that short-term exposure, well, if that's a 25-year-old who's in good health and you double their risk of dying that day, well, their risk goes from extremely, extremely, very, very low to extremely, very, very low. And it really doesn't make all that much of a difference. But if you take somebody who may be 65 or 70 years old, had a heart attack 3 years ago, or maybe they have hypertension and can't afford their medications, or maybe they're a smoker or have diabetes, or if for whatever reason they have an increased risk, if you take that person and double their risk, well, then you're doing something really important. So we look at air pollution as a risk multiplier of whatever the underlying risk is that that person may have based on their health. And then the third takeaway from these graphs is that if you look at the curves, all of them are steepest at lower levels of pollution. And what that means is that you get more bang for your buck for cleaning up relatively clean air than you get from cleaning up relatively dirty air. Now, the other thing I put on these graphs, if you look at these vertical lines, these vertical lines represent the EPA National Ambient Air Quality Standards. These are the levels that the EPA says we should be at or below to be safe. So if you look at the PM 2.5 chronic exposure over the course of a year, they say it should be 12 micrograms per cubic meter, and that's the safe level. Well, that's right about what we are in Philadelphia and in Pennsylvania. It's very close to that level. Let me go back here. If you look at the levels of, say, short-term exposure to the PM 2.5, say 12 hours, they say it should be less than 35. To put that in perspective, when we had the wildfires in Oregon and in Washington last, I guess, August and September, a lot of the air pollution from those wildfires was carried with the jet stream carried east, and a lot of it settled in southeastern Pennsylvania. And we had a number of days where our short-term exposures was around 90 micrograms per ml, or about 3 times higher than what the EPA says is reasonable. So that's just to put that in perspective. The other thing to notice about where these lines are placed is that it's totally arbitrary. They're on relatively steep flat areas where moving them a little bit to the left is where you get a big advantage. So now if we look over at the text on the left, there was an EPA scientific advisory committee that was supposed to advise the EPA on what these levels should be. And what they determined, this committee, was that if they reduced chronic exposure from 12 to 11, there would be 120,000 fewer asthmatic attacks in children across the United States per year. If they reduced it to 9 from 12, there would be between 20 and 40,000 fewer cardiovascular deaths per year. When they made that recommendation in 2018, the response of the administration at the time was to fire the advisory committee and ignore their recommendations. So the recommendations haven't been changed. So these graphs show mortality related to air pollution, but there's a lot of morbidity that not mortality also. And there's an awful lot on this slide that we don't really need to go over all the details, but just to point out that all of these things, there are plenty of studies that demonstrate blood pressure, for example. If you're exposed to higher levels of PM 2.5, blood pressure goes up only slightly, but then if you move into a cleaner area, it goes down a little bit. And while the blood pressure rise may not be much, when you talk about a lifetime of exposure over an entire population, it can make a huge difference. We now also know that air pollution is responsible and is a provocative cause of type 2 diabetes mellitus. And we also now know that it can be associated with dementia, Parkinson's disease, kidney disease, obesity, preterm birth, and we've all heard about COVID-19 mortality increasing where there's more air pollution. But it's more than just that. There are now studies that demonstrate a profound impact of air pollution on cognitive function. There was a study of middle-aged healthy people in Los Angeles that showed 3 different kinds of cognitive function being impaired by exposure to levels of air pollution, which we get every day. Also, there are reductions in productivity that have been demonstrated, a variety of different kinds of productivity. And I'd like to point out this one about Major League Baseball plate umpires, that when carbon monoxide levels go up slightly because of increased traffic around the stadia, even slight increases in carbon monoxide of 1 part per million results in an 11% increase in incorrect calls among Major League Baseball plate umpires. And we know that these particles of the air pollution are associated with Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. So it's important to understand that while every segment of society is impacted adversely by air pollution, not all segments are impacted equally. Like almost every environmental issue, air pollution is a social justice issue which aggravates inequality. African Americans are 3 times more likely to die from air pollution, and their children are twice as likely to have asthma. Housing patterns resulting from decades of discriminatory lending practices mandated by the federal government, placement of highways and power plants favoring the economically powerful, has resulted in 78% of African Americans living within 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant. Low-income communities may have less access to the mitigating effects of open space, trees, air conditioning, good health care, and are more likely to live and work near exposure to high levels of traffic-derived air pollution. People of color breathe more than 60% more traffic-derived air pollution than whites. Now, if we look at this map of childhood asthma in Philadelphia, the red area is the greatest frequency of childhood asthma, the dark blue next, light blue next. And you can see that the greatest frequency of childhood asthma and the next greatest, North Philadelphia and West Philadelphia. We could superimpose this map over the heat island map, and we can superimpose the heat island map over the homeowners loan corporation maps that I showed you to begin with. This map of asthma is basically a map of air pollution exposures. We could, if we chose to, superimpose a map of where public housing projects have been placed in the last 50 years, these same places. And if we put a map of industrial brown sites, the maps would all overlap. So no coincidence. Now, let me talk a little bit about indoor air pollution. And it's maybe slightly off topic, but I think it's so important, I just want to go over it. A lot of the outdoor air pollution seeps into our homes. So it seems obvious that bad air gets into the homes through open windows and leaks. Tobacco smoke has been shown to leak from one apartment to neighboring apartments in duplexes and condos. And so the particulate level pollution in a home is generally similar to that outside. But I'm going to focus for a few minutes on the pollution that we generate in our own homes intentionally. And basically, it's the gas stove. Natural gas is methane. They call it natural gas because it sounds better, but it really is primarily methane. And when you burn methane, you combust it in your kitchen. These are the byproducts of combustion that are then in the air that you breathe. The carbon monoxide, we already mentioned carbon monoxide levels outside stadia, how it interferes with the effectiveness of Major League Baseball umpires. I wonder how small, tiny increases in carbon monoxide exposures in your kitchen, I wonder what impact that has on our teenagers doing homework in the kitchen. There are no studies that demonstrate that, but I can't imagine that there isn't some impact. But the main thing I want to talk about is nitrogen dioxide. So nitrogen dioxide, which is formed when we combust methane on our kitchen stoves. The EPA standard for outdoors for 1 hour is 100 parts per billion. There are no indoor standards, but when you use a gas stove in your kitchen, if you don't have proper ventilation, you can easily get 2 to 3 times that exposure in the kitchen. And so children living in homes with gas stoves have a 21% increase in lifetime risk of asthma and a 42% increase risk of wheezing. And the symptom severity is correlated with the nitrous dioxide exposures. Now, before you all panic, those of you who have gas stoves in your kitchens, just be aware that ventilation makes a big difference. So if you have a vent that's operating well and discharges outside and not a crawl space, that can dramatically reduce this risk. But opening windows and using a vent are important. So what do we do about these exposures, and how do we lessen our own risks to both indoor and outdoor exposures? Well, first of all, indoors, we can get personal air quality monitors and purifiers. Air quality monitors, which I show on this one particular brand, which reports out on your iPhone, they can cost anywhere from $100 to $200 and read out whether or not you're at risk and what the exposures are. Purifiers cost a little bit more, but they've been shown to be a very effective. Portable room purifiers can reduce the particulate matter by 50% and have been shown to improve surrogate markers like blood pressure and other things actually improve when you have these monitors, but they do cost several $100s for a good one. It's important to keep your air filters clean, and it's important to ventilate if possible and to electrify your appliances when and if you can. If you have a gas stove and you don't have good ventilation or a good hood, replacing a gas stove with an induction burner can be very expensive. It can be several $1,000s, but you can get an electric induction burner, a portable one, which is what I use. I place it on top of my stove. Mine cost about $65, and they work much better than a gas stove. They're digital. You can dial in the exact temperature that you want. They work very quickly and efficiently, and they're much, much safer than a gas stove, and that's an option for some people that's less expensive than switching the whole thing out. Outdoors, it's important to limit exercise when the air is polluted. It's been shown that when people exercise, in a clean area like a park, at the end of that exercise period, heart and lung function is at least temporarily improved. That improvement does not occur when people exercise in heavy traffic areas near a roadway. So exercise is good for you, but exercise may not be good for you if it causes you to breathe more rapidly and you're inhaling bad stuff as you're working. Electrify outdoor equipment, lawn mowers, snow blowers, leaf blowers. If you can't electrify them, then you can use a mask. The same kind of mask that we use for COVID-19 can filter out some of these air pollution particles. And so if you really have to use these things, wear a mask when you're doing it. But if you're at risk, if you're older, if you have heart disease, just don't. And especially, the lawnmowers on a hot day with ozone, just don't do it. Get a younger person to do it for you, or find some other solution. As far as looking at air quality, when you're exercising outside, all the weather apps on your phones have the EPA air quality index. They color code it according on this slide. And what they're good and moderate is based on a composite of ozone and particulate matter. Just be aware that when you look at the air quality index, the monitors, there really aren't very many. And so the monitor that tells you the air quality in your region is really a regional thing, but air quality can vary dramatically from neighborhood to neighborhood. So if you're near a highway, your air quality is probably going to be a lot worse than what the app tells you it is. If you're in a park, it's probably better. So it's important to also understand that while we have personal things we can do to electrify our appliances and our activity, wear masks and ventilation, those things are important and are very effective, but we also need public activity because we really need our politicians to come forward and do the right thing. And so far in Pennsylvania, it's kind of hard to get that done. I mentioned that here on this slide, that communities routinely degrade their own environments, and watersheds and tree canopies are not adequately protected. Let me talk a little bit about the tree canopy. So trees, as we mentioned when we talked about the heat islands, trees are important. They reduce temperatures, but the leaves also uptake gaseous pollutants and remove them from the air. The leaves also intercept particulate pollutants, and then when the rains come, wash into the ground and reduce the harm from them. So they diminish the heat island effect. They also clean stormwater, support biodiversity. But it's not just any tree. A single large tree can remove up to 3 to 4 pounds of pollutants annually, which is 70 times more than a small tree. Isolated trees here and there don't work nearly as well as clusters of trees properly placed in order to shade a home so that less air conditioning is needed. Trees work together in tandem. And I have a photograph here on the right of Oakwell, which is a 13-acre tract of land in Lower Merion, one of the last areas of basically untouched land in Lower Merion. And there are 600 large trees, many of them more than 100 years old. And the Lower Merion School Department is planning to remove 500 of those trees so that they could build a ball field, because it's cheaper to build a ball field there than on top of a parking garage or on top of a building, which is what some schools have done. So, people make decisions like that. In part, these trees, by the way, they buffer a lot of the air pollution from the Blue Route, which is nearby. So people in power make decisions like this in part because they don't have a full understanding and a full knowledge base of the full impact of the decisions they're making. And perhaps they're thinking just of the priority of their own projects rather than thinking of the more overall general good. And it's up to us, I think, to make sure that policymakers at every level understand what they're doing and understand the need to be more inclusive in their agendas than just their own personal charge that they have. So amplify your voice, and I guess most of you here are doing that already. So it's important to make sure that our policymakers know how to connect the dots. And the good news is that we can address most of our important problems all simultaneously. No matter what our political priority is, eliminating dependence upon fossil fuels is the key. And looking at healthcare, just according to models at the EPA website, a 15% reduction in the use of fossil fuels for electricity will result in $20 billion per year of avoided healthcare costs nationally, $2 billion a year in Pennsylvania alone. So the single most important thing we can do to reduce healthcare expenses, and the single most important thing we can do to improve the health of Americans, is to reduce our dependence upon fossil fuels. And we could very easily go through the same kind of scenario with social justice, the economy, migration, and militarism. That the key to addressing all of these, the single most important thing we can do to address each one of these, is to reduce our dependence upon fossil fuels. So that's my talk. And I'm happy to take any questions and answer any questions and entertain any comments.
To welcome Julia Menzo. She can really provide us with the tangible, hands-on experience that all of us are longing to understand, so that we can make plans both for how to protect our buildings and our people, but also how to help our community. So I'm gonna, with a lot of gratitude and appreciation and respect for your long-term commitment and that of the Lutherans, I need to really underline that the Lutherans have made such a powerful moral and practical commitment to disaster preparation, and we're really grateful to benefit from that. So welcome, Julia.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for inviting me to be here today. I live in Lansdale, Montgomery County. I know Paul is in Chester County, and I heard some folks Upper Darby. Would you mind just putting where you are in the chat physically, or where you are most frequent, so it gives me some context too? And then sometimes I work mostly in Eastern Pennsylvania, but sometimes there's things that come to mind in other places that I can reference to as we're going through here. I'm going to just start by sharing my screen. So we got folks from Delaware County, Chester County, Upper Darby, Wilmington area. Okay, great. Thank you. So just going back to just commenting on some things here in Chester County and nearby that faith-based groups and secular, etc., have been involved in, and just some of the events that have impacted our area in recent times. Sandy hit 2012. Bucks County was severely impacted there. If you were in Chester County in 2014, you probably lost power. There was quite a bit of power outages during that time, a lot of tree damage. Of course, the pandemic affected us all. And also Chester County specific, there was the North Coventry fires, if anybody remembers that, in the right before Tropical Storm Isaias hit in 2020. There was the North Coventry fire, and that demanded a huge community and faith-based response. So I'm going to try to be through the presentation. I'll be kind of speaking to some of these and the role that local community organizations, faith-based organizations can play and played in some of these specific events. And then in 2020 Tropical Storm Isaias, southern Chester County, like the Avondale area, was really hit hard by that. And Lehigh Valley and Eastwick neighborhood of Philadelphia, which I was shaking my head when we were talking about the golf course, because Eastwick is bounded by the Cobb and Darby Creeks, and that is absolutely a concern of the folks in Eastwick. And then I don't even have on this slide is Ida. So that's something we're all collectively working on now in Chester County and around the all of southeastern Pennsylvania. So wanted to talk about IDA specifically to start off as some examples of what's going on and just how faith-based partners can fit in early on and later. But one of the examples that I wanted to mention is this Red Umbrella partnership with the Brandywine Health Foundation. This group, it came about because during IDA, and that they were in the Coatesville area. That community was hit real hard, as was Downingtown, Modena, southern Chester County. But if you remember IDA, we had torrential rains and flooding to the degree that we have not seen in many places in this part of the country for quite some time. So when that happened with IDA, this woman put up a red umbrella, and her name's Jen Manthe, and it became the meeting place for people who wanted to come help clean out basements and so forth. So as far as like a community response, and this went on for a couple weeks, people would meet at the Red Umbrella and they would get kind of assignments. They knew that there was houses on this block that needed to be checked on and cleaned out and so forth. So this was a very grassroots effort. It didn't have official there was no official group that came in, and it just kind of happened. So just want to kind of put that in people's minds too. Planning is something we highly recommend, but sometimes it's also having the flexibility and wherewithal to say, our neighbors need help, we're going to go out and support this effort. So that's one example in Coatesville where that really made a difference, and that organization then formally formed a 501c3, and they are up and running and still helping IDA survivors, but they called themselves a Red Umbrella partnership, and they are continuing to work to this day based on the fact that people were meeting at the Red Umbrella. So that's where that came up. I'm going to skip the other examples from now, and I'll come back to them in a little bit. Just to talk about the bigger picture with IDA right now, to give you an idea of where we stand with that. In Chester County, this is again just from Chester County. I'm pretty Chester County specific today, but I can say for IDA that Montgomery County has similar numbers, and Philadelphia, we're trying to understand the needs there yet too. So the Chester County data, this is the most recent, fairly stable since January, because the registration period closed for disaster assistance from FEMA in January. So some 2,700 households applied for FEMA assistance after IDA, which happened in September of 2021. 10 of those were awarded max grants, which means it's around $33,000 that a family can get if they meet the most rigid criteria and have the most, that kind of damage. As far as social vulnerability, we have some data on that too. 288 of the registrations include folks that are over 65. 183 of them indicate some kind of access and functional need, and 393 of those folks have indicated that their income's less than $37,000. And 33 registrations indicate all three of those social vulnerability conditions. So part of what we do collectively is try to reach some of those folks, especially those who are most vulnerable, and provide a coordinated response to them. And when I say we, and Paula, you asked me to talk about who has what role, and I'll get into this more in a little bit, but honestly, early on when things happen, there's a huge emergency management component and response. And as I mentioned, there's the neighbors helping neighbors, and that's critical as well. But emergency management is really responsible for that early piece. They have relationships with the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, and there's a coordination for that mass care, shelter, food, medical attention. But that lasts a very short period of time. So once that ends, then it's up to all of us to kind of figure it out. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more coming up here too. But just when we know that that there's these needs, it's really up to a bunch of partners who could serve the role of trying to identify who of those folks right here, right now in Chester County still has outstanding needs. One of the things we talk about is the sequence of disaster assistance. So on the left in that orange box, this is both the beginning and the end is these community partners and faith-based organizations, your local United Ways, the Salvation Army, and so forth. So this box on the left is when the event happens, and that's when you have your red umbrella organizations, you have people, emergency management coming out, and really the neighbors helping neighbors. And so that's where, as far as congregational preparedness goes, talk about that in a little bit too. How can you position your community, your stakeholder group, whatever you want to call it? How can you have yourself ready to step up when something happens? And then if an event like the North Coventry fires is something that happened, if that event is something where there's going to be long-term unmet needs, often the needs are related to housing, whether it's renters or owners. It's where people going to live if they can't live where they were living, like if their home for whatever reason is uninhabitable. So they're going to start going through insurance processes and trying to find out, do they have money that can cover hotel stays? Are they able to stay with family members? But insurance is a big part of it. In something like the North Coventry fires, you won't have those next 2 blocks with FEMA, and next 3 blocks actually. So you won't have that, and you'd go right to the orange block, but on the right. But if you had something like Ida event like we had in this past summer, there's going to be a whole period where the county government, local, county, state government's going to be doing disaster assessments and determining if the region qualifies for federal disaster assistance. That could be public assistance, and that public assistance will be in the form of money to communities to repair bridges and roads and sewer lines and things like that. And it can also be individual assistance that goes right to families. So you'll have that application, and the SBA also comes into this picture. It's because it's the only way the federal government can make a loan to individuals, so they do that through the Small Business Administration. So oftentimes people will have the opportunity to apply for SBA loans. If they don't qualify, they're kicked back for FEMA for more grant assistance. And then finally, we go back to the right again, which is where we are right now with Ida, in this period of long-term disaster-related unmet needs. So here in Chester County, for example, this is 8 months after the storm. I'm not doing the math well, but 6 or 8 months after the storm. And we still have, in Chester County, I think there's 10 families still in hotels. In Montgomery County, there's still 100 families in hotels. And that's just the families they're mostly renters. There's still numbers of families that we have not done enough outreach for to find out where are these people, are they living in their home in unsafe conditions? Are they still living with friends and family? But we are pretty sure that there's folks out there we have not collectively done the outreach for to find out what their unmet needs are. And we're just getting to those folks. And that's when I say we, it's a lot of faith-based organizations like Lutheran Disaster Response, but it's also in Chester County specifically, United Methodist Committee on Relief is very active. There's also UCC Disaster Ministries, the Salvation Army, etc. But that doesn't mean that other local churches and local community partners can't be involved in that right side orange block there either. And that is absolutely where we can use support from community organizations on these long-term disaster-related unmet needs. So just wanted that to me is a helpful visual. It's kind of like on the very beginning and the very last parts of disaster recovery are where faith-based groups can really play a role. And so what we do with to try to get people to recover from disasters and help them, and again, a lot of it's related to housing. It's it's a whole process of identifying long-term unmet needs and helping people remove barriers to their recovery and find resources they need to recover. So identifying families is one of the most difficult parts. And then after we identify families, something that's become really critical, and it seems silly to put it in here because it seems mundane, but obtaining consent to share their information with organizations who can help. So one of the things that's important is that we get permission from families once we find out they have a need, that we get their permission to share that information with other helping organizations so we can work together, because without being able to leverage each other's resources, we're not able to help. Like if you had a community shelter at a church on that left-hand orange triangle, like let's say there was a shelter that was in place after a storm, and you knew that folks had come in and you were worried or concerned about some of those folks, and you had their names on a piece of paper and you had some follow-up information. But if there wasn't consent to share that ethically, we still would have trouble. Then you would have trouble if you couldn't help them on the next step of it, getting them more help if you didn't have their consent to share information. If it's a small list, it's easy to go back and get that consent. But when you have thousands of people, it's very difficult to go back and find who those people are, which is where we kind of are right now. Another thing to help focus in efforts in outreach is social vulnerability indexes. And I want to this is a tool that I've found helpful in the last couple of years, and I'm gonna see if I can find where I had this. Here it is. Okay. This is a CDC social vulnerability index, and it helps us look at where communities might be that you hear information on the news where people might be or where they were impacted, but it kind of determining where we're going to focus our outreach efforts. We look at social vulnerability indexes, and this helps us. So the index, this is from the CDC, is it on a scale from 0 to 1, 1 being the most vulnerable and 0 being the least, and it's based on factors like access to transportation, crowded housing, ability to speak English, poverty rates, and so forth. So if I go here and I put in Westchester, this is, I'll get my social vulnerability result, and they have a score of 0.358. So that's, again, it's from 0 to 1. So that gives me one indicator. If I go to Coatesville, I'm going to look at this result. So here I have a 0.9525, much higher social vulnerability than Westchester. So we might focus our efforts on outreach first in Coatesville, even though the voices crying for help might be louder in Westchester, for lots of reasons. But honestly, it feels like some of the folks that we need to serve in disaster are some of the most invisible folks in society to begin with. They're concerned about coming forward because of documentation issues, because of legal challenge, things they have in their background and so forth. So we are trying to seek out folks who are in the highest vulnerability areas. I'm going to go back to the slide presentation. I'm going to skip some of this stuff. So again, once we get past that first orange block, there's a number of partners that can assist, from volunteer organizations like Lutheran Disaster Response and local emergency managers to local community nonprofits and businesses like United Way, or the local hardware store can be a vendor that's giving discounted rates, community groups, survivors themselves, other governmental agencies. And what this kind of group brings is resources that can assist, coordination and leadership to help meet unmet needs, and then kind of all coming together to figure out how do we make decisions around funding. If there's, community funds that are raised for survivors, how do we collectively decide how to use those? And again, a lot of that goes back to the social vulnerability pieces. So again, how can congregations be engaged and be kind of poised to assist or even be resilient so that their own physical structures sound, and is able to kind of, if you're in the midst of it, take care of yourself and then take care of others. So keeping insurance up to date is important, making sure those policies cover your physical structure and so forth. Also being clear who your decision makers are in emergency situations. So again, talking about your physical structure, who makes decisions about keeping the building well maintained and so forth, but also, is there some kind of relationship that a community partner like a church can have with a local emergency manager? For instance, my home church, we have a relationship with our council. Our church council has a relationship in writing with a local emergency management agency here in Lansdale that will service the shelter for if there's some kind of event where people need to have temporary shelter. So we've had things from like just gas line breaks in an apartment complex and people need to be evacuated for a short period of time. The last time I think we used this was during Hurricane Sandy, when there was a need to have an overnight shelter in case people needed a place to go and they lost power. So it's that decision is already in place, and when something happens, it didn't necessarily have to be the church council president. We decided we wanted that person to be our church sexton, but just the decision was made who gets to make that decision whether we're going to open or not for something like that. It can also be that you make a decision on, like Paula had said, being a cooling center or a heat center too, in the wintertime. But just having made decisions about, do we want to step up, and who makes the decision when that happens. Thinking about what are your mission critical ministries. So if there's a disaster in your community and your whole kind of essence is compromised, whether it's the physical being or your people can't get to church or there's just chaos. And I'm thinking, this is a real scenario here in Ida. Again, my context is Lutherans, but Messiah Lutheran in Downingtown, the building was flooded significantly in this past fall. And so they decided, what are the things that, if we can't even meet here, what do we want to find a way to continue on in other ways? Is it our food pantry? Do we want to have worship so the community can come? So those are some things they had to think through, what do we want to put our focus on as far as serving our community? Because I think one of the take homes, like Paula, you said, nobody needs one more thing to do. So during disaster, think what you already do well and pivot it to disaster. And that's my last bullet there. You don't necessarily have to do something new. Sure, go out and find that red umbrella or encourage your folks in your community to do that. But you can also keep just finding ways to keep doing what you're doing in the midst of disaster, because it is part of that orange block on the left that is your community safety net. And during times of disaster and community upheaval, that's going to have to be even stronger than it is in day-to-day times. So thinking about what those mission critical ministries are. And just one other example, I had mentioned that Messiah Lutheran was damaged, but then another partner just outside of that area that was not impacted as much, which was Good Shepherd Lutheran in Coatesville, they knew of Messiah's plight and offered that the folks from Messiah could come worship at their building, join them for services. So they combined communities for a period of time, and Messiah just got back into their building and they've returned to their normal life there. But just thinking about, if you're just outside the kind of impacted area, how can you help those there? And that was just, again, they kept doing what they're doing with just basically just worshiping, but they invited those who were impacted to come worship with them. Just two recent real life examples there. Wanted to give an example too of some other faith-based responses, going back to some of those previous events. And again, this is kind of the early on, like time of impact, left side orange block. With that North Coventry fire, it was a Pottstown Branch Community Church stepped up early on, and this is something we have the need for in Ida right now too. They served, and they just kind of kept keeping track of the families who were impacted and where were they moving, what did they need, and that some folks from that church took the lead in figuring out how do we match families with what am I trying to think of? Like it was like matching with a sponsoring church or other organization. So then that organization would take care of helping them move into a new place, getting them furniture and so forth. But it took somebody to step up and commit to being that coordinator. And that Branch Community Church in Pottstown did that for the North Coventry fires. So just kind of trying to give examples of how communities of faith can serve and step up, because there is no one that is assigned to this role when something happens. It kind of takes all of us. I don't want to get to the contacts yet because I had one or two things that I wanted to mention yet. One of the pieces was, let me look at, I wanted to show some pictures just on what Richard had commented on as far as just the impact of climate change on our area. And when we do this work, I just wanted to share some pictures. I thought of it as he was talking. Some of the things that we do in trying to improve resiliency when something's happened is when we're working with families for long-term rebuilding and recovery, we are trying to do some adaptation types of things. And I'm going to just show some pictures here. So one of the things we're doing is when we put in new heating systems, we have this bottom blue piece is like a flood sock, and it's I think it's neoprene, and if there's flooding that's happening, that homeowner just lifts that up over the mechanical equipment. So the other way we're starting to help with mitigation is by elevating mechanical equipment. That's another method we're using. Another one is we are installing mold resistant drywall. So that purple there, this is in the Eastwick neighborhood. Again, this is an area in Southwest Philadelphia, right near the airport and the Hines National Refuge, that was severely flooded in the Isaias. So we're putting mold resistant drywall in. So that's some of the things that we are doing there. And I guess just some tidbits that are coming to mind are that another way that faith-based organizations could really be helpful, and one of the challenges we're facing now is around affordable housing, and certainly that's not disaster specific, but disaster exacerbates it. So we're trying to identify landlords who would be willing to help us take on some of those folks who would be more eligible for the affordable housing side of things. And whether that's then working, identifying landlords who are in our congregations to play a role in that. Again, I said we have a number of families that are still in hotels just because they cannot find affordable housing in Chester County. So it's helping to find landlords or faith-based communities somehow subsidizing that rent to that landlord. But that's one kind of creative piece we're looking at. And then just want to also comment on what Dr. Tobin said in regard to just the bigger picture and policy. I still think the biggest thing we can do collectively is advocate for policies to reduce our carbon footprint. And so that, I showed you the things we're doing with the elevating heating systems and so forth. But what I didn't talk about what the local community in Eastwick, which is a almost 85–90% African American community, is doing for themselves. They are very engaged in advocacy for their own community, and they're looking at land swaps and helping to move relocate people from one part of Eastwick to another part of Eastwick. So some of the things that we're trying to do as Lutherans, which is a largely white denomination, to kind of, somewhat ashamed of that. But one thing we are trying to do is to amplify what the folks in Eastwick are doing for themselves. So, there's lots of different ways that all of us can be involved in this at the congregational level. And I just trying to kind of share some of the various ways that folks can be engaged, from neighbors helping neighbors to long-term recovery to advocacy. So I will stop there. And Paula, you tell me if I missed things that you wanted me to say.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You did more than I had even hoped. I especially appreciated the concrete examples of the recovery piece that's around adaptation, because we don't want to just reproduce the problem for the next storm or the next tornado, etc. But I would like to ask you just to describe, because I think probably most of us haven't ever done this. What should each of us talk to our emergency management? Who are those people? What should we be asking them? What kind of relationship do we want with them? The township or municipal and or county people.
And in Pennsylvania, at least, and to your point, yes, we're very locally oriented here. Every municipality has a designated emergency manager. So someone representing the community, your communities of faith, I just let them know that you're there and you're a willing partner would be one thing, just if there's, and start the relationship, because then they have your number and they can, when something happens, they can call, because often one of the things that's most in need is space. Or ask them, if there's something going on in the community, can we just to have that relationship so that you can call them up when something happens and say, could we have a breakfast for first responders? We know this just happened. Could we host them for a breakfast, or could we raise money? But having that relationship, they're the best person to guide you as far as how to engage very hyper locally. So yeah, I would say well worth your time to find out who that person is, and I mean, you call up your borough or township office and ask who that person is, and they can tell you.
So the other piece I was thinking might be just important as a reality check, and then I'd love to open it up to questions and comments for everyone else. But I remember when we did this series before, you and Janet, who was at the time the Chester County level person working on these issues, pointed out that I think most of us think there's someone out there who's going to help us. And I loved your chart. It's us at the beginning and it's us at the end. But there's someone else. Obviously, someone else has a plan. There's money. There are resources. But I was myself taken aback and take a big, gulp to say, oh, if you're not at a certain level of emergency, you're not going to get the authorization you're required to actually get help. And so I think if you could just share, how does that work? How are decisions made about who gets what help, just loosely, so that we have that reality check.
Sure. And I don't know the number, like the actual, what the thresholds are as far as numbers go, but it is driven by the property damage that's the dollar value of property damage to the degree of that there will be state or federal help coming. So when there is a disaster event, that's when it's one of the pieces of messaging that we as communities can do is to really encourage anyone who was impacted to report their damage to their local municipality. And if there's a number out there for registering for FEMA assistance, getting that, just reporting your damage, because all of those numbers add up to determine whether you're going to get a state or federal declaration. And some of it can be for, again, public assistance, which is more common, and then for individual assistance. And it's very rare that we get a federal declaration for individual assistance in Pennsylvania. The time before Ida was in 2011 with Tropical Storm Irene and Lee, or Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Lee. So that was the last time we had a federal declaration, was 2011. Eastwick, the pictures, I'm going to show you. This is Eastwick. So this was 2020, August 4th, 2020. They did not get a declaration for this storm, and it was very widespread. But the issue was that it was very hyper local, so there wasn't enough damage to qualify for a federal declaration. To your point, no one's necessarily coming. So the funding that's been raised for Eastwick to repair, I mean, we talk about like going through winters without heat. There were 25 families that went through the winter of 2021 without heat, heated their homes with space heaters and kerosene heaters. And, you know, a number of us were working in the meantime to try to find, okay, who were they? Could they get help from LIHEAP or already existing utility programs in Pennsylvania? And then we are very happy that by the winter coming 21-22, all of those families had heat, but that funding was raised by faith-based organizations, grant funding. We did get some money from the city, but it wasn't, because it wasn't a declaration, there wasn't federal funding. And that's a very sore point with the people of Eastwick, especially since you know, we have these declarations from IDA, and some of the counties, there's 8 counties in Pennsylvania who have a federal declaration, and some of them only have that designation because they're adjacent to counties that were declared and had some kind of threshold level. So it seems like there's not a need in largely white communities, and they got the declaration, and Eastwick's largely black and did not get a declaration. And I know it's the way the policies are written, but that's where you go back to institutional racism. So, I mean, this is all related. And I understood what, you know, Dr. Tobin, it seems like our presentations are very different, but the vulnerability factors are very, you know, it's all connected. But I hope that gives some idea of how that works. It starts with reporting your damage to that local emergency manager, and then it kind of compiling all together to see where do we get, you know, do we as a municipality, do we as a county, do we as a state qualify for federal assistance. Otherwise, funds are raised by us, local community foundations, faith-based organizations, things like that.
And likewise, should all of us reach out to the Red Cross? Which of these organizations that you
I mean,
mentioned?
Red Cross, I don't think it's always good to have relationships with anybody. And Red Cross is a great partner, but I don't know if they will be there, I guess they will be there regardless. I don't think that, because they have the, you know, memorandums of understanding with emergency management that if there's some kind of threshold, that kicks in automatically. And that's driven by the county relationship with Red Cross.
All right, let me turn it over. Thank you so much. Let me turn it over to other people who'd like to either make a comment or ask a question. Anyone?
I just want to say thank you. There's so much good information here and lots of places to plug in, to think about, to take back, to have conversations. I think that's really important in what we're doing.
Thanks, Debbie.
Well, I'll ask another question and then I'd be happy to wrap up early. No harm done there. I know that it came up in the previous conversation about how important it is to have a plan, and that it's better that even congregations that have big impacts and don't even follow their plan, they do better than those that didn't have a plan. So we wanted to comment on that, but also the more particular thing is how important is it or what form would you recommend that we support our individual households to have a plan?
So, I mean, the first question, it sounded like, you know, the plans for congregations, I absolutely am with you on that. It's better to have a plan than not, but that doesn't mean, it shouldn't stop you not having a plan from engaging anyway. And I do think that the decision maker is one of the biggest pieces of that plan piece, that just knowing how you're going to make decisions in a crisis, it is key. And so even if you have a plan like this is how we see a scenario happening and it doesn't play out that way, could be a whole different scenario, but you still have the people in place and to make those decisions. So that's one of the reasons I think it's good to have a plan. And the household plans, I mean, I still am in favor of very similar things. It's just on an individual family level. Make sure your insurance is up to, you're covered for what you need to be, but then having, thinking about how you can stay in place, like shelter in place if something happens, and it's that 3 days of water, canned food, batteries, can opener is the big thing. And those are easy supplies to find, lists to find online. The other big piece of that, I think, is the notification systems that the state and counties put out. If you go to readypa.gov, that you can put in your zip code and it'll allow you to register for notification systems, and you can opt in or out of weather related ones or traffic related ones or whatever. But those notifications are really helpful. And then just having, each of your phone numbers written down. I mean, I don't know my kids' cell phone numbers, so we don't do that anymore. So just having things written down so that you can call from a different phone, it's another huge one, I think.
Thanks. Thank you. Other questions or comments before we wrap up? Bill.
Yes, I've got a question, and maybe it's not just for Paula, but for everyone, and that's about flood insurance.
Yeah.
Your meeting house or your church, do you have any comments on that? I have no idea if we have flood insurance. I doubt if we do, but.
And that's a huge issue, because most people don't have it because they don't need it. So they're not required to have it. So Eastwick is a great example of that. Many of the families in Eastwick either own their home outright because it's been in their family for generations, so they're not required to have insurance, period. And then a lot of them didn't have flood insurance. So then because for a couple reasons, they felt it was too expensive and they weren't required to have it. But now that has really hurt them. So I'm not sure if that question, I'm helping you answer that, or if I'm answering the question, but it's very common. Like where I live, I'm not required to have flood insurance. It's just in a house that's kind of high ground. I have a sump pump, but if something were to happen, like I could, even though I'm not required to have flood insurance, it's something I might want to consider anyway. But it's weighing that risk of, do I want to pay however many $1,000s a year, or do I risk losing what's in my basement, or hopefully not first floor, but just with the hotter weather that we're seeing here, it's not uncommon to be flooded where you weren't expecting to be flooded previously. So it's something I think all of us need to at least talk with your insurance agent about, get their opinion of that. The other thing is the National Flood Insurance Program. If you're in a floodplain, then you're required to have national flood insurance. And that's, I don't know the ins and outs of that, but that's another thing I would just ask the insurance agent about it. But it has been a huge issue that not having flood insurance really set a lot of families back in the ECS event. And I mean, that meant they didn't have heat for a winter. If you're willing to risk that, that's one thing, but it's also, some families were telling us it would cost them $10,000 a year. And they're like, I'm not doing that, which you can understand too.
Now, I want to reinforce your point about those of us who aren't in a nationally designated floodplain, that I was at a Chester County presentation on the new flood maps, came out several years ago now. And there was someone who did an analysis, and there wasn't an entirely matched correlation to where the flooding happened. And obviously we looked at the communities who saw flooded in Texas. They definitely never thought they were in a flood zone. So it doesn't map accurately anymore. If it ever did, I don't know, but it certainly doesn't now. So I think it is worth a conversation to see what will be the cost to us if we don't get flood insurance, if we're anywhere near something that could lead to that kind of catastrophic? Because it's one thing if you're the Rainy Run River Museum, you can hope it never gets that high, but you're right next to the water, so I assume
Right.
you have flood insurance. But if you live somewhere where you just near a feeder creek or not at all, unfortunately, a higher and higher percent of those locations are also getting catastrophic flooding. So it is an important question to pursue.
Thank you both.
Any last calls on comments or questions for Julia? Well, I want to thank you so much, and I know you're an ongoing resource for all of us. And it's not a one and done, and that any of us can reach out to you and to the VOAD. Thank everyone. Carol from Hartford, it's lovely to have someone from so far away. And we really appreciate Robert joining us from London Grove and Western Quarter, and our Delaware folks, and our Middletown meeting and Goshen meeting. So thank you so much. And if there are no other comments and questions, again, our gratitude both for our speakers, but also for the love and compassion and concern all of you are sharing by showing up and doing this work. So thank you very much.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paula.
And we'll upload the recording. We'll start.